This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In this series, I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at the top 10 cards from a single set, 2010's Scars of Mirrodin. Phyrexia All Will Be One will be out in the very near future, so it's a good time to look at cards from this block in particular, as it's all about the Phyrexians invading Mirrodin and converting it into new Phyrexia. All Will Be One will be set on this plane, which used to be Mirrodin. Scars of Mirrodin was a pretty powerful set that has had and continues to have a big impact on competitive Magic. That's reflected in this list, where the top 6 cards all have 100 or more points. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Scars of Mirrodin. That means there were 218 cards eligible for this list, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it is Leonin Arbiter. This 2-mana 2/2 prevents both players from searching their library unless they pay a tax of 2 generic mana. Obviously, this is a nice card against any deck that likes to search their library a ton, but there are lots of ways you can really abuse the Arbiter. It has gained the most points in decks like Modern and Vintage Hate Bear, which are aggressive white-based decks that look to play creatures that are both disruptive and have a solid stat line, and the Arbiter certainly fits the bill there. Most decks have ways to search their library in those formats, including things like fetch lands. However, these decks go further than that in making the Arbiter great. They include cards like Ghost Quarter and Path to Exile. Using both of these cards is pretty nasty with the Arbiter in play. Ghost Quarter can become Strip Mine, and Path to Exile can become a better Swords to Plowshares. These decks also use Ether Vial, which means you can put the Arbiter into play at instant speed to come out of nowhere and keep the opponent from being able to search their library. The Arbiter is going to keep gaining points in both Modern and Vintage. At number 9, it is Revoke Existence, which is this set's Disenchant effect. It's a sorcery, unlike a lot of versions of this effect, but being able to exile things in most cases is a lot better than destroying it. This is because many decks have ways to get things back from the graveyard. In other words, being sorcery speed instead of instant speed is a decent trade-off for that upgrade. In addition to this original printing in Scars of Mirrodin, it then received a reprint in both Born of the Gods and Theros Beyond Death, giving it more time in Standard. In all of those cases, it was pretty useful, since Scars of Mirrodin was an artifact set and Born of the Gods and Theros Beyond Death were enchantment sets. In addition to block and standard success, it also sees play in Pauper. At number 8, it is Etched Champion. This 3-mana 2/2 comes with Metalcraft, one of Scars of Mirrodin's big mechanics, and one we'll be seeing more of on this list. If you get 3 artifacts in play, the champion gains protection from all colors. This card didn't see any play in Block or Standard, but it was right at home in Modern Affinity, where Metalcraft was pretty much a foregone conclusion. Additionally, those decks use things like Cranial Plating and Arcbound Ravager to make this huge, and that's great because creatures with any color at all can't block it, and that's most of them. It has slowed down a bit in Modern over the last few years, as the original Affinity deck has morphed into a +1/+1 counter deck that isn't nearly as focused on more general artifacts as it once was, but it is still seeing some play in Legacy Affinity decks. At number 7, it is Grasp of Darkness. This card's very straightforward, as it's simply a 2-mana instant that gives a creature -4/-4. This is an efficient removal spell, as it can take down most creatures for very little mana, and like with most spells that lower a creature's stats, you also have an alternate mode, where you can use this after attackers and blockers to take down an even larger creature. In addition to its Scars of Mirrodin printing, it was also in Oath of the Gatewatch and Core Set 2021. It saw considerable play in all 3 of those standard formats, as when it tends to be around, it is one of, if not the best, black removal spell in the format. In addition to standard success, it's also powerful enough for both Pioneer and Historic. All that said, it hasn't gained any points since 2020, but all it would take to gain more points is another standard reprint, as a card like this will virtually always be played in that format. At number 6, it is Memnite, a 0-mana 1/1. In a lot of decks, a 1/1 wouldn't really be worth the card, even for 0 mana, but the fact this is an artifact creature makes all the difference, since artifact-based aggro decks have done well in multiple formats. In Standard, it was played in Tempered Steel decks, which had no problem getting advantage out of artifacts, either from the eponymous enchantment or cards with Metalcraft. Modern, though, is where memnite has thrived the most, where it has been played alongside powerful cards, like the aforementioned Arcbound Ravager. More recently in Modern, it's been played in pure Steel Paladin decks, where it can really help you get Metalcraft going quickly. It has also seen limited play in both Extended and Vintage, and it's likely to gain more points in the future. At number 5, it is Wormcoil Engine, an incredibly powerful creature. It comes packing Death Touch and Lifelink, which is great, but what really makes it insane is that if your opponent does manage to kill this monster, you get 2 3/3 tokens, one of which has Lifelink and the other has Death Touch. This means that it is typically going to generate a 3-for-1, and that's something that it's hard for your opponent to come back from. Basically, if you don't have a way to exile or otherwise deal with this without actually sending it to the graveyard, you'll probably lose. While it was played in Standard, it has really excelled in Modern, where there are several decks that can put it into play incredibly early. Tron decks and Amulet Titan decks can do it on turn 3. Wormcoil Engine is hard enough to deal with when it comes down normally, so it's really hard to deal with in the early game. While it's seen a ton of play in Modern, it has also gained points in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage, where it's seen a lot of play in Mud, a mono artifact deck that specializes in producing tons of colorless mana very early in the game, so you can see why the engine is played there. Wormcoil Engine probably won't be slowing down anytime soon, but that's largely true of the cards ahead of it too. At number 4, it is Mox Opal. Like most Moxen, the Opal costs 0 mana and can tap to produce mana, and in this case that mana can be of any color. Of course, it does have a couple of downsides. One is that it's legendary, so you can never have more than one of them in play. The other is the Opal doesn't do anything unless you get Metalcraft going. But if your deck is loaded up with cheap artifacts, you don't have to work that hard to make this do its thing, and a 0 mana Mana Rock is incredibly strong. Unsurprisingly, it's been played in artifact decks across pretty much all of Magic's formats. It was so good in Modern that it eventually got banned out of the format in 2020. It enabled really fast starts, and while that worked okay in earlier Affinity decks, the printing of Urza Lord High Artificer made artifact decks even crazier, making the ban of the Opal necessary to slow that deck down. It's still gaining points in both Legacy and Vintage, so it won't really be losing its spot anytime soon. At number 3, it is Ratchet Bomb. This little artifact can tap to gain a charge counter, and it can be tapped and sacrificed to nuke each non-land permanent with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on it. Used correctly, the bomb can result in the game being utterly reshaped in your favor. Like the other cards at the top, this has been a card that has impacted pretty much every format at one time or another, and because it's colorless, it's shown up in a really wide variety of decks in all of those formats. It is especially spicy in formats with lots of low mana value permanents, because in those decks it can come down and nuke a bunch of stuff with 0 to 1 charge counters. It's going to keep on gaining points. At number 2, it is Galvanic Blast, another Metalcraft card. Without Metalcraft online, Galvanic Blast is shock, and that's a pretty good fail case. Then when you do have Metalcraft going, it is a more powerful lightning bolt, doing 4 damage to its target. There have been a lot of artifact-heavy decks over the years that have been able to use this at full power without too much trouble. The block and Standard formats it was part of had a ton of artifacts, with many decks having an artifact theme or sub-theme, so it saw play in a lot of different decks, including things like Grixis Control and Red Deck Wins. It's been most successful in Modern, where it's gained a ton of points in Affinity decks, and more recently, Urza decks. It's also played in artifact decks in Pauper. It's going to keep on gaining points. And at number 1, it is the so-called fast land cycle from the set. These would have been the top 5 on the list if I separated them each into their own slot, because they all have over 200 points. These lands are called fast lands because they tend to only enter untapped in the early game, since you can only have 2 or fewer other lands in play, or it enters tapped. Obviously, this means that more aggressive decks are interested in this cycle, since the lands get a lot worse in games that go long. All 5 of them have been played at one time or another in every one of Magic's formats, resulting in their massive score. They're just great dual lands for many decks in many formats. They're also about to be reprinted in Phyrexia All Will Be One, meaning they will only extend their lead over everything else on the list. So, those are the 10 cards from Scars of Mirrodin that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including many more that look at individual sets, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.